The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to the Able to Care podcast. I am so excited to be joined by an expert in the field of mental health advocacy, safeguarding and capacity assessments today. Lorna Warriner is an independent mental health nurse with over 17 years of experience. I think I've worked that out right as far as 17 years. She's obviously first off, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Right. So, registered mental health nurse, now works independently. You've been involved in capacity assessments, safeguarding reviews, and you've acted as an expert witness in quite a number of different environments or situations. And I came across you because you, on LinkedIn, you put a few posts that really resonated with me as far as looking at language. I'm very wordy, and I think we're going to sort of get on famously as far as the wordiness is concerned. As far as the impact on the language we use around mental health capacity. And obviously, as part of the Able to Care podcast, we're appealing to paid and unpaid caregivers who some may not be overly familiar with mental capacity, some may be lost in the world a little bit of mental capacity. So hopefully today we'll explore a few different topics and take it from there. So first off, why has mental capacity become such I can tell it's kind of an emotive issue for you in some ways?
Yeah, so it's always been a framework that I've used in practice ever since I qualified. So I qualified in 2006. So the MCA was actually, it was written in 2005, but published in 2007 and workable from then. So it's always been something I've had an interest in and have used, and also around the Mental Health Act, I have a particular interest in that. And then I was one of the first best interest assessors to qualify back in 2009. I say qualify, that was before it was a qualification. I was one of the first best interest assessors. So it's always been a piece of legislation that I've used when working with people. And as you say, the posts that I put out on LinkedIn, they all speak from my heart about the frustrations I see in practice, around how complicated the Mental Capacity Act has become, or should I say how it's been perceived as being so complicated. And the Mental Capacity Act itself isn't that complicated. It's the interpretation of it. So my posts are deliberately polarising, but because I see that we need to break down and demystify that, how complicated the MCA is perceived.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, fantastic. So obviously there may be some people who aren't familiar. So obviously the Mental Capacity Act, as you said, 2005, is there to protect two parties predominantly, isn't it? One is to protect those who may have or may need support in their decisions being made on their behalf, but it's also there to protect those who are actually making the decision on that person's behalf. So do you want to go into a little bit of kind of your understanding of mental capacity and maybe some of the misunderstandings around it?
Yeah. So the way I see the Mental Capacity Act as it is now, it's designed to empower and protect and safeguard people who may not have capacity to make specific decisions. But as you say, it's equally there to, as a piece of legislation, to protect people who are making those decisions on behalf of those people in their best interests. And I think that people become so frightened of getting it wrong that's where some of that complication comes from, because the anxiety kicks in.
Yeah.
But it isn't meant to be that complicated. It is there to safeguard everybody. But I think it needs to be I love this phrase and I'm going to use it, and it's not one of mine, I wish it was. But Ben Troke, who's a lawyer for Waitman's, I think, sorry Ben if I've got that wrong, but he talks about deprivation of liberty safeguards, which was born from the MCA, which we might come on to, and I can explain what that is, as a spotlight as opposed to a padlock. And that's where I think some of the misinterpretation is around what the MCA is. It's there to safeguard and empower people. It's not there to restrict and make every decision for somebody. So for purposes of the audience that will be listening to this today, as long as you can evidence that you are, that you've exhausted everything within your means to enable the person to make the decision for themselves, and you are making it in their best interest, then you're protected also under the legislation.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is such an important part of legislation. As you said, it's a nice way of putting it, the spotlight rather than the padlock, 100%. It's kind of to, as you say, you're giving credit to whoever said that originally, or Ben. I think when I'm teaching about it, one of the things I try and get over is the importance of choice as far as human autonomy is concerned, and how valuable it is, and how many choices we make every day, and maybe take them for granted. A lot of the time, that even I get people to sometimes talk or make a list of what choices they made to kind of get there today, like the choices of what they wore, the choice of what they had for breakfast, choice of who they spoke to and didn't, and how they got there, and transport and stuff. And I often get the joke of a case of, we didn't get a choice whether we turned up or not, but they still did. There may have been consequences to that choice, but they still had that choice in that moment. And there's very little in life where we have for the majority of us, that have our choices taken away from us. And I think it is so important for those who are within a care environment, who have other people kind of acting as advocates on their behalf, that people really understand the importance of our human value to personal choice.
I love that. I love that. I was talking to a group of colleagues this morning about legislation and people that make what is perceived as unwise decisions, which I'm sure we'll come on to. And it was really interesting in that forum because the initial comments were quite a black and white view around use of legislation. So, well, you can use the MCA, or you can use the Mental Health Act, or you don't use anything and you can't do anything. But that's not true. I think, and I don't know how it's become that and how it's evolved into how I describe sometimes as that gateway to services or not. Thinking about what you were just saying, Andy, that you should start with, can the person make the decision for themselves, and do everything within your power to enable them to be autonomous and make choices before you even think about the legislation. And obviously there is a spectrum of decisions and when you may need to intervene, but the starting point is always, can you enable the person to make that decision for themselves?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's worth going into. Obviously, you got you got the 5 principles of the Mental Capacity Act, which is you've mentioned a couple of those already. But the 2 basic prerequisites, obviously, for a capacity assessment to even occur, of even thinking about making a choice on somebody else's behalf, there's the 2 criteria in there that must be met. One is there must be some impairment of a person's ability, or some impairment of brain functioning, I think is a correct wording, and you're the experts, you'll have to correct me on that. But some impairment of a person's brain functioning, whether that be chronic or acute. And it must affect that person's ability to make that particular decision. And I think that's where I think both you and I agree with this. And it's one of the things that I've encountered that I find very frustrating, where people just throw out this term, they lack capacity. And that for me is immediate red flag, as far as, one, I think we'll talk about the word lack, which I know you've put a post out about, but also it's just that blanket term. Well, about what?
You could see that my physical behaviour changed when you were saying some of that. Well, just to go back a little bit, I mean, it's quite right. That's the MCA just does set out that 2-stage test. So I really don't like this, I probably should put a post out about this, but it's called the diagnostic test. So that is whether they have an impairment in the or disturbance in the functioning of the mind or brain. And then the functional element is around, I don't want to say test, but that's the language that's used, the assessment of the person's understanding of that specific decision. But actually, there was a case law, JB, in 2022, I want to say. I should have researched that before I came on, but if anybody wants to Google it, you'll be able to find it. And what that case was talking about is actually it needs to be the other way around, that the functional assessment is what you need to consider first. But even before that is what I was saying, can the person make the decision for themselves by providing them with all practicable steps? So that's where you should start. And the reason I think it's moved around is because, and I've certainly seen this, people will not use the MCA as a piece of safeguarding legislation because they say, well, the person doesn't have a diagnosis, for example. But if you read the Code of Practice, you don't have to have a diagnosis in a traditional way that is perhaps alluded to in the MCA. I mean, people could have problems making decisions for addiction reasons, or they may have a delirium that's undiagnosed, for example. So I think it's important that people switch it around, because by having it the other way, people are excluded from the safeguards of that legislation. And we do see that sometimes with deprivation of liberty safeguards, whereby some applications are not made to the local authority because the person doesn't have a formal diagnosis. So yeah, that's just a plea from me, really, that people think about it in a different way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's something that, again, we chatted out in some of the posts that we had. I did a podcast recently with a lady who struggled to get a diagnosis for her mum, and so many things that she couldn't access funding or appropriate support or medical interventions because there was this underlying thing of, well, she has capacity. And she didn't. She was very good at putting on the show. She was very good at doing the kind of, rhythmical communication and echolalia and stuff like that to say the right thing in the right moment. But there just wasn't that capacity there to really understand how her condition was impacting on her well-being. It was a dementia related as well. So challenging. And she just, it's such a long time for her to be able to get any support. And the constant thing she kept going, well, she has capacity. She has capacity. But I think it was purely, she doesn't have a diagnosis. And I think that's really the crux of what you were saying there, the frustrating of that she doesn't have a diagnosis, so we're not even thinking about mental capacity related to her.
Yeah, and so that's really frustrating to hear that story, because it should be based on there being a reasonable belief that she may have difficulty making certain decisions. And then we'll work out why that is, after we've assessed her capacity for that specific decision. But I don't think it's helpful the way it is set out. And hopefully, whenever we will get the new MCA refreshed, whenever that will be happening, hopefully I know it will set out the test in that way, which hopefully will help in that situation.
Okay, so we've got the kind of the criteria to start off with, and then we're going into the kind of the 5 principles, aren't we? The first one, which is, I believe I remember reading a statistic about one time, which I think it was something like 53% of people made the assumption that if a person has a diagnosis, they then make the assumption that they then lack capacity. I think it was something along those lines, like 53% of people. So the first criteria is we assume capacity in every decision a person makes until proved otherwise. And again, correct me at any point if I forget any of this or get it wrong.
The presumption of capacity. Yeah.
I think one of the reasons I kind of know it, I think for me, I feel it's a fundamental toolkit to being a caregiver. That if you are I have to be the expert in the Mental Capacity Act if I'm any point making decisions on somebody else's behalf. It is my tool, it is my armor, it is my justification, it is my legal defense, it is everything. So for me, absolutely, I've got those 5 principles memorized in my head. Because if ever I have, let's say, a next of kin who's arguing about a person's best interest, then I need to understand that to go, well, look, I understand your point of view. I understand what you want, but this isn't in the best interest based on all of the relevant information. And it was kind of making sure I knew what my legal standpoint was to appropriately advocate or safeguard on behalf of others. I think that's huge.
Yeah, and ultimately to promote the autonomy of the person you're caring for to be able to make those decisions, hopefully for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I had a situation where a gentleman was kind of crawling around on the floor on his hands and knees. He was okay. It was no particular harm, but his family were not happy about the fact that their dad was on the floor, and they perceived it as neglectful and stuff like that. I said, you need to get him up. And I said, he's gardening. He's happy. He's okay. He's not a risk to himself. He's not a risk to anybody else. It would cause him more distress. It is just not in his best interest to stop him doing that activity and get him up. That's going to cause him more confusion, more disorientation. So it's that kind of knowing what my rights were as a kind of a caregiver versus the kind of the perception, the prejudice, I suppose, in some ways of the family. And that's not being derogatory to them. I know it's so hard seeing a loved one change and acting in unusual ways, but I think that's, for me, where I feel the law is really, really important to understand.
I think that's really important, and I like the way how you were describing about the framework of making best interest decisions for people. It is really helpful to be able to explain that to people who don't understand the legislation, understandably so, but using it as a framework to explain why certain approaches might be used or certain decisions made, and breaking it down by explaining what do we mean by best interest. So in that example you gave, to prevent him from to crawling on the floor is something is an activity that for his own reasons enjoyed, or he got some reward from it. To be able to restrict him from doing that actually goes far away from what he wants to do. So using a best interest framework to explain why we would, in their view, allow him to continue to do that is really helpful. And that's why we should, as professionals and caregivers, you're quite right. It's there to empower us as well, just as much as it is the person who doesn't have capacity.
Yeah, if we're working on their best interests and on their behalf, absolutely, that's where it falls in, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so go through this first one then. So assuming capacity, a presumption of capacity in each situation. Where have you encountered that, where that first principle isn't understood and isn't kind of managed appropriately?
I think sometimes I've seen it being used as a reason to not support somebody. And of course I'm generalizing here, but it's misunderstood, or the terminology is misused. So for example, it's typically if somebody is difficult for services to engage with, and they might have some complexity around their mental health, or the reason why they may be making risky decisions, for example. And I've seen professionals say, well, I'm not assessing their capacity because I have to presume that they have, and then they'll walk away or say, well, there's nothing we can do because they have capacity. But they've missed the bit that I said right at the beginning. Forget the diagnosis, forget the nice service box you're trying to fit them in. Is there reason to doubt they may have difficulties making a certain decision? And if there is, that's when you use the framework of the MCA and assess whether they have capacity to make that decision that you're concerned about. So I think I've seen it in that way where people have used it as a bit of a, I'm going to say, excuse to walk away sometimes, to say, well, I'm using the MCA and I'm presuming they have capacity. There's nothing we can do. Um, and it's that using it in that black and white way really frustrates me, because even if that were the case, that doesn't mean there's nothing to do.
See, I think I've encountered it more on the other side, that it's a case of there's a presumption of a lack of capacity due to the person's condition and diagnosis. Because one of the courses I mainly teach is around restraint. So we do a lot of, obviously, behavior management. We do all the restraint training and stuff like that. So in some of the environments, so I was working recently with security team, an NHS security team. And they often get called to wards and things like that because they might have an individual who is not staying in bed as requested, required, or whatever makes it easier. And sometimes that term is thrown around going, well, they lack capacity, so you have to stop them from leaving. And I've trained that security team to kind of be more familiar with the Mental Capacity Act and DOLS and anything else. It's a case of, not necessarily. It should be least restrictive method anyway. So are they going for some fresh air? Are they going, let's look at the reason why they wanted to get up and move around. That, yeah, okay, it may not be safe for them to just go, and that may not be in their best interest. But again, it's capacity to do what? It's not just throwing in capacity for their medical care. Is it capacity to decide what they want to eat, what they want to wear? Just the fact that they would like to get up and go for a walk for a moment doesn't mean that they then lack capacity. So I think that's where I've encountered it an awful lot of kind of they've got this and therefore.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, I do see that a lot as well. Maybe I've become a bit more immune to that issue. But it's, I actually saw this the other day. I was looking at some paperwork for a safeguarding adult review, and it was around, sadly, the person died following quite serious self-neglect. And the person had been seen by a number of professionals who wrote in the records, doesn't want support, has capacity. Well, what does that mean? Has capacity for what? And what I would much rather see, and what is more in line with the legislation, is not to say has capacity or doesn't have capacity. It's if you believe that there might be some concern about them making that decision, you have to formally assess their capacity. So if if you have no reason to doubt their capacity to make that specific decision, you still need to provide a documented audit trail of how you've reached that decision. So that doesn't mean it has to be a complicated assessment. That could just mean, I have no reason to doubt this person's capacity. They were able to understand, they were able to communicate, they were able to retain all of that. And this is what they said this is what their wishes and views were on that decision. Great. But what happens is people don't do that, and they just say has capacity or lacks capacity. But they've not shown the working out for that. So I have seen it like that as well, Andy.
Yeah. I think what you just touched on there is really, really significant. And I'm wondering if that's maybe the bit that people, or maybe isn't, because I don't know whether it's specifically mentioned within the legislation itself. Obviously, it's the ability to kind of make that choice. But is it in the legislation as far as breaking down how we actually make choices, or what we mean by making a choice? Because you just gave a few aspects of it there, didn't you? As far as one, it's the ability to understand the information, to retain the information, to weigh up the outcomes of that information, and be able to communicate it back. They're the four aspects that I would refer to as far as choice is concerned. But I don't know whether that specifically, is that taught? Is that educated? Is that, because a lot of people just go, could they make the choice or not? And I think there's four aspects to making a choice. So yeah, I just wondered what your opinion was of that.
I think the legislation, that it has lots of challenges to it, but I think it is clear in that it's explicit in terms of the framework you have to use to determine whether the person has difficulty making that specific decision or not. I think it is clear. I'm not sure how it's become this black and white tool to they do or they don't, because we said we would come on to this, but it's probably a good time to talk about it. In terms of why I don't like the terminology lacks capacity is for exactly that reason, because it implies that you have formally assessed their capacity without necessarily showing the working out. So if you say, I have no reason to doubt this person's capacity for these reasons, they were able to understand, etc., that's more in line with the legislation. I mean, there are lots of other reasons why I don't like the term black anyway, just negative connotation to it.
Yeah.
But I think it doesn't help that very black and white view of you do or you don't. I'd much rather the language being a bit more explorative and narrative and wordy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's going into that depth, isn't it? I think most people we take choice for granted, I think, don't we? That we just have it, we just do it. It's sometimes like trying to, well, how do we make choices? A bit like trying to explain to somebody how you fold your arms. Well, I don't know, I just do it. So it's breaking it down into those stages for people to understand that, you know, there is multiple things that go on. So I think I told you I was going to, that I have a box of chocolates analogy that I use when I'm teaching, and maybe I can share that with you and you can kind of decide whether you like it, hate it, or whether it kind of works for you. So it's kind of going into the second principle as far as we should ensure or help a person to make the decision as best as they can. Again, I know I'm not getting the wording quite right there, but it's allowing them to make as much of the decision or make the decision with support if needed. Okay. I think I've got that right. So I use a box of chocolates analogy. If you take a generic box of foiled chocolates, not your brands, just a generic kind of box of foiled chocolates, where they're all wrapped in these different coloured foils, different shapes, different, different, and all of them are different chocolates, different tastes, different textures, etc. Okay. If I was to go, which chocolate would you like? Would you be able to make an informed choice? And more than likely, you wouldn't, because you don't know this brand, you don't know what each of the chocolates are, so you wouldn't be able to make an informed choice. But that doesn't mean you then lack capacity. It means I need to present the information to you in the right way. So most chocolate companies provide, a little key where, this chocolate is this color and this chocolate is this color and this is this flavor and stuff like that. So now can you make an informed choice? And the usual response is from people, yes, now I can make an informed choice. I said, but what if you can't read? If you can't read, that bit of paper was useless. So suddenly you might need me to read that for you. Or what if your English isn't your first language? Or there could be lots of reasons why you can't make that choice. Even though I presented the information, have I presented it in the way that you understand that you can work with? What if you were colorblind? What if the room was really dark and therefore you couldn't make out the colors of the chocolates properly? What if one of the ingredients says this chocolate contains flug or gurgle and you've never heard of that before? So do I need to explain what that is in appropriate language? What if I really rush you and go, come on, quick, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's it. You get what you're given now. You can't make a decision. And some people take longer to make a decision. If I'm choosing where I buy a house, it takes me longer to choose than if I'm going to choose which chocolate I want. So, but some people take longer to make certain choices. So am I giving them enough time? Am I being coercive because I think you should eat the blue ones because I don't like them because they're coconut? We get loads of exploration on this simple premise of just a box of chocolates. And actually there is so much that we do need to consider. There is complexities to it. But the general thing is, I need to understand the person. I just need to make sure I'm providing the information in a way that they've got the best chance of doing it. And not providing that way doesn't mean they then lack capacity. You know, if I listed off a list of 20 different chocolates and you've got dementia, for instance, you might remember the last one. And therefore, you can't make an informed choice. So I might need to break it down into restricted choices, like, do you prefer chocolates or toffees? What kind of toffees? Soft toffees or hard toffees? And we could kind of break it down. So I use it as a kind of analogy to really get people to think about how they present choices and meeting the needs of the individual in the best interests, as well as kind of the least restrictive options. So Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that little thing I created.
I love that analogy, and I'm going to steal it. It's really good.
You
I
can,
think
by all means.
it's a very practical way to describe that what is termed practicable steps, meaning have you given the person every opportunity and all of the information they need to be able to make that decision. The only thing I wanted to say about that as a word of caution to people is that don't set when you're having to give people all of the information about the box of chocolates, you don't need to set the bar so high about that box of chocolates that it makes it harder for them to understand. It's what's
Mm,
termed the salient information, but I prefer to just
yeah,
call it the important information. So you wouldn't if you were doing assessing somebody's capacity about making the right choice about which chocolate they had. I mean, you'd have to not allow your own views to get in the way of which is the best chocolate, but as
100%.
still a good
Yeah,
analogy which we can continue to use. But it's about not setting the bar too high. So you wouldn't expect them to have to understand where the chocolate has where it was sourced, and how it
mm,
came into the UK, and um, some of the potential ethical issues, for example, about importing and exporting chocolate. So if we use that analogy in terms of another decision, it might be about having insulin, for example. You wouldn't expect the person to have to understand, retain, use and weigh and communicate all the information about the medical or have a medical degree about the use of insulin is what I'm trying to say. It's not
yeah,
setting the bar too high that makes
yeah.
it so difficult for them to understand what you're asking them to decide.
Yeah, I like that. Like that kind of goes even deeper. I love the kind of if we following the box of chocolates analogy on, yeah, where it was sort of, yeah, it's that here and now, isn't it? What's important to them in the here and now. But I suppose this is where, as much as you can, and maybe this is where maybe your role is very different in some ways. That if I'm working with a client, the hope is I've got as much information as I possibly can, their history, so their biography, their personality. I'm hopefully including other people that know them well within kind of the best interest decision and stuff. That would be the ideal, and this is where when parents or you become LPA kicks in, for instance, you kind of hopefully lots of knowledge and information. So if I know they always used to prefer this type of chocolate the most, I shouldn't then assume that they are always going to want that. But it must be hard for, especially in the NHS, where there is very limited access to those sort of information of previous history. If I know, let's say, this individual's a vegetarian, so they can't have anything with meat in it, or we can expand the analogy on further. But do you think that's one of the challenges, or how do you think that is simplified within something like the NHS, for instance, to kind of work around?
Do you mean because we have a limited amount, or not limited, but we're confined by what we can offer people?
I suppose it's a bit of both, isn't it? Yeah, it's a bit of both. Limited information, history, biography, and sometimes those decisions are having to be made in that moment as well. We can't always wait to do a full best interest assessment with gathering all the information in, as well as, yeah, limited as far as the choices that might be available as well.
We're moving on to making best interest decisions. And what I would say about that is you don't always have to make a best interest decision, even if the person doesn't have capacity. And what I mean by that, it shouldn't be misinterpreted. I'm just careful that that might be misinterpreted. What I mean is, it doesn't have to turn into what people think it is in terms of it being a big forum, a big best interest meeting, or a huge protracted consultation with people who know the person, because there might be limited options that you can offer anyway. So um, you can't offer options to the person that are not available, even if it's something that they wanted in a best interest type situation. So if you're assessing their capacity to, it wouldn't be fair to expect them to understand concepts of things that are not available to them. I don't know if that's what you meant or if I've answered your question, but I think it's what's reasonably an option for, or what is a viable option for them, are the things that you would talk to them about. I don't know whether that makes sense or whether I misunderstood the question.
No, I think it's an aspect of what I was asking there. Definitely, I think the other part of it, I think, is the limited access to information we might have when we are making a decision on behalf of somebody. So let me give you an example, for instance. Maybe we could work from there. So let's say that we have an individual who is now got a diagnosis of dementia. We'll keep it simplistic that there is a diagnosis. And this individual is from, let's say, Jewish heritage, and within a care environment or even in the NHS or something like that, Jewish heritage. And one morning they say they would like a bacon sandwich for breakfast. So here's where I would kind of go, okay, so becomes complicated, because just because he has dementia doesn't mean we can presume a lack of capacity. Okay, we can't, even if we think it's an unwise decision. If I was Jewish as well, maybe that'd hold some prejudice around that of whether I think it's okay and whether it isn't. But I can't assume just because I think it's a bad idea that means that I get a right to make that decision on his behalf. Now, the ideal scenario would be that I'm able to maybe talk to his family, find out, is he a fundamentalist Jew, or has he actually has he always eaten bacon sandwiches? Has he always sort of said, do you know what, one thing I want to do before I go is have a bacon sarnie. It may be really difficult to access all of that information, especially before breakfast. And I think that's always a thing I've found difficult maybe for me to get my head around as far as mental capacity is concerned.
So what I would be thinking about in that situation is, what is the impact on him by not having that bacon sarnie? And that's what you need to work with, rather than, of course, past wishes and views and religious beliefs are important to take into account. But that's why it's important when, I know you might not have the time, but I'll just say this. It's important when you are assessing capacity that you triangulate that approach by looking at past behaviours or past decisions, by talking to people that knew him. But most importantly, talking to him first. He might be able to say, look, my family didn't know, but I always used to have a bacon sandwich. But that should be the place you start with, in terms of what is the impact on him if we don't give him what he wants. He might be making a choice that is contrary to what we believe about him as who he is as a person, what his beliefs are. But if he said, oh, actually, I'm not really that bothered. I just said it because I'd quite fancy one. And then you could talk him through, well, about his beliefs and past choices, and assessing and working it through with him. Or if he becomes so preoccupied by it because you're just not listening to him, that's, it's bordering on being quite restrictive by not allowing him that autonomy to change his mind the same way that all of us do. So I think the first thing I would have done is spoken to him and try and judge what is the impact of enabling it and not enabling it on him. Because when you're thinking about, so say he was assessed and he didn't have capacity to make that decision, that's when the best interest bit comes in. And that's the bit where you would have to weigh up what's proportionate, what's restrictive, and having that triangulation approach by talking to people about his past wishes and feelings. And actually, if at the end of it, what's the impact going to be? He's going to be more distressed if we don't give it to him. Then the best interest decision may lend itself more towards it being, we'll give him the bacon sarnie if that's what he keeps asking for. But then, continually assessing it and revisiting it with him. But I do appreciate what you said at the beginning. Depending on the decision, you don't always have time to do that consultation. And that's what I was getting at, which I didn't finish, and I should before somebody shouts at me, is that of course, you always have to make a best interest decision for somebody. It's just you don't always have to make it so formal in that traditional sense of, a huge analysis and lots of benefits and burdens, because there are lots of decisions that we make for people all the time that don't reach that very formal scenario, and are perfectly legal as long as you're following the principles of the MCA. They're least restrictive, it's in their best interest, it's not too far away from their wishes and feelings, so it's necessary to prevent harm, all of those things. So I don't know if that answered your question, Andy, at all. I went off a bit of a tangent then, but I liked the story.
It's one that I sometimes use as an example, and I've come across similar things before, especially around. I think it's obviously. I don't know whether it's different for yourself. It's sometimes, again, it's family. Sometimes kind of they might be very upset about that because they want to have that element of control sometimes over the choices that are being made. So they may feel very unhappy with dad having a bacon sandwich. But then the carers are letting him have one. And then that's where the kind of, oh, well, that's abuse and stuff like that starts getting hurled around a little bit. And I think you've mentioned there is the importance of recording it, of kind of going into, look, this is why I felt in that moment. There was no reason to doubt his capacity around this particular decision. He understood what bacon sandwich was. I asked him about, and he said he'd always fancied one, and you logged it down. You've written a note of it. And that, I think that's what you're kind of alluded to a few times, isn't it? That it doesn't need to be this massively complicated thing. I've just gone through that process a little bit with him, just had the chat, explored a few options, and then gone, as you said, what's the danger of, is he going to become more distressed by saying you can't have a bacon sandwich than actually then the concerns we might have post incident?
Yeah, but exactly that. And I think what's important is that you have that conversation with him. And I think autonomy and empowerment should be the first thing you consider. So it's having a conversation with him about that decision. And then throughout that decision, if you think, well, I'm not sure, for example, he may not really be able to weigh up the information about what that might mean in terms of his previous religious beliefs. That's when you could go on to a further, more formal assessment of his capacity. But if he was like how you said, if he was completely able to tell you what it means in terms of his religion, and he was able to retain that and understand it, I would be wanting to see, I have no reason to doubt his capacity. He said this, and this. So we're giving him the bacon side.
So what do you feel from your point of view? And obviously, been expert witness in cases, and I should imagine both like standing up for going, yes, they made the right decision, and sometimes probably going, no, they've made the wrong decision or haven't followed the protocol properly. What would you say are the biggest misunderstandings about Mental Capacity Act?
I think you can't get it wrong. You can't, if you use it as it is designed, you can't make a wrong decision about capacity as long as you follow the framework of the MCA. And what I mean by that is, I see a lot of people still who are really nervous about using the MCA because, understandably, it is a big burden, and quite rightly, it should be a big burden because you're taking somebody's decision-making autonomy away. So it should feel like a burden. But I say that's a good sign. That means that you're taking it seriously, that the burden is entirely on you, not the person you're assessing to prove anything. You're just trying to find the best way to support them. So the thing I see is that because people are so frightened of getting it wrong, getting the final determination wrong around somebody's capacity, means that they'll be criticised, that they'll go to court, that they'll have people questioning their decision. But actually, in reality, you'd be more criticised by not following the MCA and walking away from it, and just saying has capacity, it's nothing we can do. You'd be more criticised for that than you would making a decision that some people might not agree with. And that's where the MCA empowers you as a professional, because as long as you can demonstrate that in your professional opinion, you have reasonable belief on a balance of probability. So what that means is 51% and above, that in that specific moment in time, the person didn't have capacity for that specific decision, you're fine. You'd be more criticised if you decided not to use it because you're too frightened. It's also important to say at that point, and I'll emphasise it again around, as long as you have reasonable belief on a balance of probability that that is your determination in that moment, that doesn't mean you also can't change your mind the next time you assess the person's capacity. But
Yeah.
equally, that doesn't mean that that person will not have capacity again. Then the next time somebody else comes in and assesses their capacity, that's the nature of capacity. It can be fluctuating, it can be complex. So I would just like to try and alleviate some of that anxiety in people and demystify it, that actually it's really important to know it's there to empower you as well, as long as you show your workings out.
Yeah, I do love that. It reminds me of so much at school, of kind of like, even if you get the answer wrong, if you can really show you're working out, then you're still kind of covering yourself a little bit. Even if the decision of somebody else has gone, well, that's not what I'd choose. But if you can show the process you've gone through, then you kind of you're working out all fits the box, and you've done everything right, and you've done nothing wrong on that. I really like that. Just pictured in my head as far as like still getting it wrong by a teacher, but I got some points because I worked it out right. Just made one little error at the end. So I like that. Do you think the Mental Capacity Act has changed in its application and even people's understanding from 2005 to now? It's getting towards 20 years on. So has it changed? Interpretation changed?
I think, well, obviously the case law always trumps the code of practice anyway. So case law naturally changes how we apply the MCA. So, for example, the JB, the case I mentioned at the beginning, and I still can't remember the date of it, forgive me, but that changed how we think about assessing capacity in terms of, turning the two-stage assessment on its head. So I think it's changed in that sense. But what I really like in terms of development of it is that there is a lot more awareness of applying the MCA, even if sometimes it's used in that very black and white way. I think it's moved on in that sense, in terms of, I think there's a lot, we've still got a long way to go in for medical care. I think care homes have got a really good understanding of it because we've got the deprivation of liberty safeguards, which they obviously need to think about very carefully. And I think mental health services have a good understanding. But I don't want to criticise my medical colleagues, and I'm not meaning it in that way. But that's where I see it most of the time falling down, where you see things like statements of they just lack capacity and it doesn't really mean anything, or decisions are made without assessing capacity, or people are discharged without thinking about best interests. So I think there's a lot more awareness. obviously now than it was when it was first published in 2000. It was actually 2007. And I think the MCA Amendment Bill, which we were all expecting, which has now been shelved for the foreseeable, that really went a long way to raise awareness around what we mean by deprivation of liberty and the legal requirements of all services, including, as I say, the medical field. I mean physical health when I talk about that, and hospitals and younger people, because the MCA has always been there to safeguard people that are 16 and above. But there was a long time where children's services were not really using it as a framework to safeguard people. But when we had the MCA Amendment Bill, that raised a lot of awareness around it actually impacting people 16 and above. So I think it's moved on, thankfully, from awareness raising, particularly around the MCA Amendment Bill and LPS, which has been shelved. So we've still got the legacy of that, which is great. But I think we've still got a long way to go in making it more accessible and friendly for people to use. Because as I said at the beginning, it just sometimes feels just so complicated when people are describing MCA and assessment of capacity and case law, and it really doesn't need to be. And that clouds people's confidence to be able to use it. So I think we've got a long way to go. But it's also, as we said at the beginning with Ben Troke's quote, that it should be used as a spotlight and not a padlock. I think we've still got a long way to go to change that view that it's used as being quite restrictive, when actually it's there to enable autonomy and empower people. It's not there to restrict people. So I've gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I think it's an interesting question because it's made me think about the journey of the MCA and made me realise about how much there's still so much we have to do. But it's good that we're all talking about it.
Yeah, with the deprivation of liberty safeguards, obviously I'm quite familiar with then the acid test that came in 2014. And then obviously we're looking at moving over to the LPS. But as you said, that's been shelved for now. And there's still some gaps in there that, especially around over 16 and then that discrepancy from 16 to 18 with the deprivation of liberty and those sorts of things. So it'll be interesting to see where that progresses as we're moving forward. So from your point of view, though, have you got when you're supporting people, when you're looking at this, have you got kind of top tips or the easiest way that you find to work from as far as a framework is concerned? Or is it just is all laid out there, so it's as simple as the framework is? What would you say are your top tips to it, though?
I think I'm really lucky because I have an automatic understanding now of the MCA. So I suppose I have that behind me. But that is a good place to start in understanding the two stages of the assessment of capacity, and then understanding the principles is the first place where you need to start. But then when you're asked to support somebody to make a decision, which by the way is what I think the MCA should be called, and it shouldn't be called a capacity assessment, it should be called supportive decision making. You have to start by understanding why there's a doubt that they are not able to make that decision. So the top tip there would be, and this is where I always start, what is it about this decision that people are concerned about? Why the person can't make that decision for themselves? And I start from there, and then that helps you determine what the relevant information is that you need to present or discuss with them. So that would be where I would start. And talking to the person without going into that assessment type environment is really important. Because, if you think about walking into a GP surgery, if you thought that the GP was sitting there assessing you without talking to you about why they were doing it and what the concern was, I know I wouldn't present very well. So I think that's where I would start. I would talk to them about what is their understanding of why there might be a concern about this decision, and being really open and transparent about what you're doing. Because sometimes I do have that question quite a bit. People say, should I tell them that I'm assessing their capacity? And I say, well, it depends on how, yes, technically, but it depends on how you say it. You wouldn't go in saying, I'm here to assess your capacity about making X decision. You'd need to get to know the person first. And I appreciate in practice, I know I'll have people screaming at me saying, we won't always have time to do that. But you have to have time, because how can you properly assess their understanding, their ability to use and weigh, without having a conversation about an open conversation with them about why you're there in the first place and what their understanding is.
I think the talking to the person is something that you take it for granted, don't you? But I think, it is fundamental. And I think it is that time constraint sometimes. But as you rightly said, how can I fulfill my duty of care if I'm not taking that time to listen to the one person that is at the centre of this care? 100%. Is there anything you wish people knew about the Mental Capacity Act that you feel they don't seem to know?
I wish people saw it, and I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but this is what came to me. I wish people saw it as a tool to empower. And I mean a tool that empowers everybody that's involved in that scenario, from the person who may or may not have capacity, but also the professional, that it's there to empower and protect. I wish people viewed it in that way, rather than seeing it as a tool a decision-making tool and a tool to restrict, because it's not designed to do that. And that's probably the thing that frustrates me the most, is that it's seen as that restrictive gateway in or out of services, when actually it's the complete opposite. It's there to empower and actually there is a lot more work we need to do with people before we even consider capacity.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you very much, Lorna. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that, and it was nice having a chat with you.
Thanks for having me. Nice
My
to
pleasure.
meet you.
And you enjoy the rest of your day. Nice to meet you as well. Enjoy the
See
rest of
ya.
your day.